Okay, let's get started. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone in the room meeting. Thanks for joining this webinar. And this is one of the series of webinars organized by the Computational Social Science Laboratory Faculty of Social Science, the Chinese University of Hong Kong. I'm Paul Huang, co-director of this lab, and another co-director is Professor Tony Tam, who is also in the meeting. I'm very glad to chair this webinar. And today we are very honored and pleased to have Professor Manley here. And he will give a talk titled The Role of Spatial Cognition in Urban Analytics. And in this talk, he will emphasize the role of spatial cognition in shaping mobility behavior. And before his presentation, let me introduce him to you very briefly. Dr. Ed Manley is a professor of urban analytics in the School of Geography, where he is also the interim head of the school, and a member of the Center for Spatial Analysis and Policy Research Cluster, University of Leeds. He is a Turing Fellow at the Alan Turing Institute and honorary professor at the University College London. Ed received his PhD in engineering from UCL, and before joining Leeds, he was an associate professor at the Bartlett Center for Advanced Spatial Analysis, CASA, UCL. And he is an associate editor of the Applied Spatial Analysis and Policy Journal, and chairs the GI Science Research Group at the Royal Geographical Society, where he is a fellow. His research aims to deepen our quantitative understanding of human behavior in cities and how these behaviors shape urban activity and dynamics. And his research is very much multidisciplinary, combining quantitative methods, including exploratory data analysis, machine learning, agent-based modeling, and network modeling, with theories drawing from diverse disciplines such as urban geography, transportation, spatial cognition, judgment and decision-making, and sociology. So actually his research interests are also what our lab is interested in. All right, without any further ado, please join me to welcome Professor Ed Manley. And now I pass the time to you. Ed, please.
Thank you, Rick. Let me just share my screen. Okay, well, thank you for that warm introduction. I'm very pleased to be here. Yeah, it's great to give a talk, and especially on a subject that is sort of one of my key interests. So this is an area I've been working on for about, well, maybe over 10 years now, but it still feels like there's a lot of opportunity, and it still feels sort of fairly innovative. And hopefully I'll convince you of its importance. But it's really around the role of cognition, spatial cognition, at the heart of urban analytics. So I think we start from a fairly sort of basic sort of premise. Cities are complex. Everyone sort of is aware of this, and everyone's aware of the inherent complexity within cities and how there are many, many moving parts and difficult things to understand. Yet we're all here to try and understand them. And my interest really is at the heart of these systems, of these complex systems, which is people. You know, when I started looking at sort of cities and urban analytics, urban behavior, you know, it struck me that actually people are very complex. I think that's also fairly obvious. People make complex decisions constantly. They are all coming from different backgrounds, different perspectives, and it's very hard to get traction on what's happening with everyone at any time. Yet we still do, and many of our models are quite well established, but they often oversimplify what's really happening. Particularly in mobility, we often make quite simple assumptions about what people are doing, particularly, and the premise and the sort of purpose of this talk is this simplification of how people move around, how they choose to move, where they choose to go at any particular time. So I think we can do better in terms of our urban modelling. I think there are a few reasons why it's particularly pertinent now. Our traditional long-run assumptions have been shown to sort of no longer hold. So in particular, the impact of COVID and the spillover effects in terms of working patterns has shown that we're going to need different ways of modelling how people behave going forward. We also need novel policies to meet the challenges of climate change. The impact of those policies is not yet, it's difficult to determine. And there's going to be a rising new transport modes as well. So our traditional mobility models, which assume fairly homogeneous, simplistic behaviours, are not up to the challenge of meeting these changing patterns, and I think we need to do better. Fortunately, we also have better data. We've got data on human behaviour, extremely large volumes, that is more representative of the population than ever before. And we have crossover between data as well. We have links between transport data and health data. We're seeing here at least linkages between social care and education data, and you can start to see the effects of environmental factors and other systems on impact between different systems that would usually be examined in silo. So we're getting a broader understanding of human behaviour at a larger volume. So we have this wide collection of data that combines details such as people's context, where they've been in the past, what the demographics are, which sort of environments they're exposed to, and how things change over time. So I think we've got a lot better data on people's behaviour, and we have better computation. So we can scale our models, we can scale our analyses to ever larger scales using the cloud. So we're in a very good position in terms of improving how we understand people at the heart of these complex urban systems. And we're really making great progress. There's three pieces of work I wanted to highlight by other authors. Lara's work, I think you've heard from in this series, is particularly interesting in terms of identifying how people act at different scales, maybe locally, interacting frequently, and larger scale interacting less frequently. You've seen this work as well in nature on visitation and how frequently and how many people visit particular locations based on their location and home and origin within a variety of different cities. And we're seeing more work as well on the area I'm going to focus on, which is navigation and movement. And this work came out not too long ago in Nature Computational Science around how people generally seek to minimize their deviation from their target. So we've got new data. All of these data sets all these studies are based on data sets which have been basically only become available in the last sort of decade, or even more recently than that. So we've got new data sets which can unveil many more new insights. But there remain questions to answer. So we still don't have great understanding on heterogeneity in spatial behaviour. We know there's a lot of variation in how people behave in cities, but we don't understand so well where these differences lie, why these differences exist. So the heterogeneity in behaviour is poorly understood. We've starting to establish how the environment influences behaviour, so how the built environment affects these, but we don't look at these precisely. So we know that people may navigate via landmarks or undertake particular activities in particular order, but it's very hard to precisely identify the environmental impacts that are influencing these behaviours. And we need to sort of improve representations of this relationship between people and the space around them. So while we can sort of vaguely talk about, that space does impact behavior, getting a very strong quantitative understanding of how that relationship exists is harder to come by. So I think there's a lot of opportunities here. So in today's talk, I'm going to talk about a few different pieces of work around this subject. Two of which talk about big mobility data, and how we're looking at the impact variation in the heterogeneity of behavior and the influences of different factors on navigation. I'll also talk about the fundamentals of spatial cognition. So this will be a sort of brief coverage of the neuroscience and psychology literature, and what our current understanding is of these behaviors. And then I'll talk about how we can link all this together within our urban analytics analyses in the form of new spatial models. So I'll talk about some cognitive inspired GIS models and also cognitive image-based models. So there's probably quite a lot to cover here, but I hope to wrap up in the time with enough time for questions. So the first study I'll talk about is this work, and this goes actually back 10 years now, but it was one of the sort of earlier data sets on navigation or movement data, routing data at large scale. And this was some GPS data from minicabs in London, about 700,000 journeys, where we have the GPS traces for each of the 700,000 journeys. And this is the data overall. And obviously the first sort of question you ask when you think about navigation, and this is the question Professor Huang sent me as well, is, don't people just take the shortest path? Like, doesn't everyone just, or use Google, use Google Maps or whatever other mapping services you might have available? Well, the truth is that they don't. So this study, 700,000 routes, we can compare each of the 700,000 routes against a set of alternative shortest paths. So all of these are different types of shortest path. You'll see the most sort of familiar, which would be minimizing distance or minimizing times paths, but none of them do very well. So this is a sort of overlap of the route on average, but basically we only see on average the routes accounting for about 40%. The optimum accounts for about 40% of the observed. So it's not a particularly great match relative to all of the alternatives that someone might take. So this was an interesting point, but it sort of speaks to a wider suite of optimizing models which might not match reality. So if we think about it in a slightly different way and think about, if we consider that space might impact choice, why don't we analyze these routes spatially? So what I started doing was actually looking at these data in subsets. So actually looking at them, how they map out across space. And this is one thing you can do with such a large data set, is to start isolating particular origins, particular destinations, and looking at all the choices that took place. So if we know, if we know that an optimal route is not a particularly good representation of what people do, what's going on? So these are routes from an origin air region just down in this to the south here, up to the King's Cross region of London up here in the north. And what you actually see is quite a large spread of routes, a lot of heterogeneity, with some grouping around two particular routes, one which is this one here, and one which is this one up via this park here. And these two routes account for about 70% of all the routes. But you see there's also alternatives. So people can choose two different bridges. They might go on the north side of the river. They might take a route through the centre. Might take a route around this way up here. So there's a lot of variation in this route. And what it speaks to is that there is no optimum. There's no optimum route between origin and destination. People have this sort of variation in their choices. And this plays out over lots and lots of different routes as well. All these origin in all these origins and destinations, people are generally, there's lots of spread, even at very, fixed origin destinations. However, having said all that, these routes aren't, like crazy routes. They are roughly within distance of a minimum route. So they are on average about 1.4 times the distance of the shortest possible path, but they're just deviating from that single optimum. And then you start looking a bit more. You can look at many more sort of breakdowns of these routes, and you can start seeing things like people making choices. So you start to think about, these points, these labeled points, are where there seem to be clear divergences of flow. So we're only looking at the flow of routes here, and I think we've probably got a couple of hundred routes on this particular map. But you see that at particular points, people choose left or right, and that is a choice point. And so what we're starting to see is that actually, rather than a single optimization process at the start of a journey, people might get to a point and then, choose the next point, and then get to another point and then choose the next point. So it's more of an iterative process of how people navigate across the space. And you can also start to see how this particular work looks at how people deviate from or the differences between the shortest path routes and the taken routes. And what we see are in the green areas where there's been more observed routes, and the red areas where there would have been more optimum routes. And so people are generally shunning these routes through the center in favor of these routes around the outside, so the green routes. And this is sort of an interesting process from a road hierarchy point of view, because you start to see more clustering around these particular roads. This is better illustrated through this figure here. Is that very few roads attract a lot of traffic, and it's those roads which are sort of highlighted in this map around the north and south of the center. They attract vastly more traffic than many other roads. So there's a sort of potentially a reinforcement process, and with this kind of study at this scale, it's very hard to get into the detail of what's happening and why people are doing this. But what it seems is that there's a reinforcement where people gravitate towards particular roads more than others, and that will be also reinforced in their inaction. So if you take a road every day, if you start taking a road every day, you're more likely to take that road on other journeys as well. And this sort of plays out when you see this kind of figure, very much a preferential sort of attachment to a few major roads. The last thing to sort of say about this study is there's also a difference in direction of travel, and this has been also backed up by other studies, including the one I spoke about just a minute ago by the MIT group. That there are depending on the direction of travel you're going, you may make different choices. And this map basically illustrates the differences between the direction of travel. So if you're heading north, you're more likely to take this southern green route, these green routes. If you're heading south, you're more likely to take these red routes or these the yellow routes. The red routes. And this really points to what I was saying, in terms of people making choices at particular locations. Maybe making a first choice to head to this location from here, and then you've sort of made you've influenced the remainder of your choices. Whereas you may make a different first choice when you're heading south. You may initially go towards this park area. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on here, but it's clearly not optimum. So just to summarize on this sort of study, is that we do see, heterogeneity is a clear factor. Decision points are clearly influential. There's an attraction towards particular major roads, and even shunning other routes which might be optimally superior, such as the shortest path through the center of the city. But people are generally aiming towards these major roads. There's an influence of direction of travel. But people are sort of taking this iterative process of navigation. So this was a sort of interesting to me study in the sense of what we're showing is that shortest path isn't such a feasible assumption to work by, and actually we need to look at this more. That was work we did, let's say about 10 years ago. And what it reveals is there's a sort of absence, or to a certain extent, an absence of information or use of research from neuroscience and psychology within our spatial models. And I'll come on to this in a minute, but I think it's worth actually taking a sort of look at what's going on in neuroscience and psychology, and what they say about spatial navigation and movement, and how it might influence or play a role in what we do in terms of urban analytics. So in these fields, in neuroscience and psychology, they undertake a vast array of different experimental methods, as you might imagine, from lab experiments with people, and also rats with electrodes embedded in their brains, magnetic resonance imaging, real-world experiments, virtual reality. There's a lot of work here, and they've done a lot of work linking through from the activity in the brain, and in particular in the hippocampus, right through to how people's choices manifest in real world or virtual spaces. So what we can do is start to look at this, or I'll just show you some of the key findings or key theories. The first thing to sort of say about people's navigation is it is strongly influenced by individual characteristics. So we know that age and gender play a role in how people navigate space and and their performance in terms of navigation. But also impairments, visual impairments, physical impairments will influence people's choices naturally, and your activity locations in terms of where you've been in the past, or where you usually go, where you've lived, where you work, will also influence where you know, and therefore what you do. And this process arises from how spatial memories are set up in the brain. So as you learn about space, as you go through the world, you start to put together different spatial representations in your brain, and much of this is contained within the hippocampus, which holds many of these cells which have been shown to encode spatial memory. And so when people talk about a cognitive map, which is also often a term which people use in terms of navigation, what they're really talking about is a combination of different memories and strategies in terms of how the sort of your memory of space is encoded. The two kind of areas which are most sort of relevant and most important are this sort of map-like memory, which is known as an allocentric representation, which is how different objects in space relate to each other. So it would be like a map, but incomplete. So I've sort of blurred out bits here to demonstrate how incomplete it would be, because we don't know everything, we haven't been everywhere, so we don't have a complete knowledge of how everything relates to each other. And many of us will have had that feeling of knowing there are two places and then only suddenly realizing they're very close to each other, and you haven't realized because you've basically taken different routes to get there. And that's a process called path integration, but it relates to this memory where you may have a completely missing part of the map in your allocentric representation, which would mean that you just lack that understanding of how places connect. This is combined with the egocentric scene memory, which sort of arises from your visual perception of space. So when you look around, you're walking down the street, that is your egocentric representation of the space. And so if you think about yourself walking down the street, you can see landmarks ahead of you, you can see the street, and you may have been there before. And when you think about where other locations are, you're basically engaging your egocentric and your allocentric memory at the same time, because you're thinking about, well, I'm here, I know where I am, and I know that, you know, the shop is over there, but even though I can't see it, the library is over there, even though I can't see it. So it's a fairly complex process, and I should have said this at the start, but this is all kind of fairly, this is quite complex in terms of how all of these mechanisms work together. It's still not fully understood, and there's still ongoing research, but it's fairly clear that there is this kind of ecocentric combined with the allocentric representation that help you orientate yourself. And then the other side of it is your estimation of a target. So this sort of relates to your allocentric representation, but you have a sense of direction which relates to where you're going and where you want to go, so where your target is, which may well be unseen. And so that as well, like the allocentric memory, will have some element of uncertainty, some element of error naturally built into it. And then as you navigate, you'll engage different strategies as well in terms of navigation. So I mentioned path integration, but that's the process by which you as a person looking down the street are trying to figure out where you are relative to other locations. So you're engaging this egocentric and allocentric representation. Angle minimization is another strategy. So that's where you're trying to minimize the deviation from your target, which has been shown, as said in other studies, it's shown in that the minicab study as well. People weren't deviating vastly from the shortest path, but they weren't able to find that shortest path. So people are minimizing their angle, minimizing their deviation from the angle to their target. You may also engage in some strategies around landmarks or regions in terms of the places you want to get to on the way to a target. So you may think, well, I need to, and this may not be a conscious process, but a subconscious process, but you may think you need to get to these particular choice points, particular landmarks before you get to the next one. And that may also be a hierarchical representation. So you may think, you may think I need to get to this major junction before I can sort of navigate my way to the destination. So there's quite a lot of different processes involved here, engaging with different parts of your memory. And so, and all sort of mediated by these individual characteristics. And just in case you didn't think that was complex enough, there's also external information, of course, involved in this process too. So whether you're consulting a map or other information, that will also be playing a role in how you navigate. Maybe it's informing your allocentric memory of space, or even your egocentric representation, in terms of some of the presentation of that kind of navigation information. But another important part is social interaction, and this is actually an area which is fairly underdeveloped, but it's how you work, how you communicate with other people who you're navigating with. So that might be a friend or a spouse, but they will have a different cognitive map. They may even have they may even see the city slightly differently, or at least they'll have a different memory of the space. And so you can see here, sort of crudely blurred out different parts of the city, because this person would have different experiences and different memory and different understanding of how things connect. And so and I'm sure you have had disagreements in your life with people who you've been walking with or driving with, that is the heart of it, is you have different memories of space, and so you have different perceptions. So part of that information retrieval process is collaboration, personalities, many more factors, and many kind of language, many factors are involved there. And it's, again, as I say, it's quite a complex one. So all of this is to really say is that our assumption that shortest paths or optimal paths are realistic in the context of how people behave in cities is not really very well founded. We can see there is a a complex set of cognitive processes involved, which really don't align very well with this sort of sense that people are optimizing as they move around the city. So before I move on to how we translate these into urban analytics tools, I think I'd be just wanted to touch on a bit more on what are the factors influencing navigation ability. So this was a study, actually, an interesting study because it was a collaboration between quite diverse academic areas. So it was led by a neuroscientist, but involved people who are experts in dementia, architects, and game designers. And the idea was to collect data at a global scale on navigation ability. And the project was funded actually by Deutsche Telekom, on the premise of supporting scientific research. And our core interest here was actually developing an idea of how navigation ability varies across the world by demographic factors in order to provide a tool for diagnosing dementia, because dementia manifests very early on in the loss of navigation ability. And so if we're able to have an understanding of how people should navigate or would normally navigate, then we can more quickly identify where people are deviating from that in an unexpected way, which would help us diagnose dementia. But that's not the part I'm going to talk about actually, but I'm going to talk about the findings of the study. So just to give you a sense of what the game looked like, this was a proper game developed by a very good game developer. But the process was that this little boat had to navigate a space and collect these sort of flags, or get to these, I think they're buoys. And the space was designed by architects to match urban spaces. So we have landmarks, we have certain visibility, we have junctions, and all of which allow us to link back spatial configuration to navigation ability. So the data we actually got from the game looks like this. They are trajectories. They are, little wiggly lines. Some people were able to find these flags really quickly. Some people were just, going back and forth, really struggling. And we had about, I think, 72 levels of varying difficulty. Some were very simple, like this. Some were very complex, and some of which you were given a map, some of which you weren't. There's a lot of variation to explore. And the game was a big success. So in terms of its recruitment, this is, I believe, the largest, I think I was told this, I think this is true, the largest psychology study in the world. We had 4 million players worldwide. It was really thanks to the recruitment and the advertising that was sort of paid for by Deutsche Telekom. We collected data from I think every country. We had you can see some of the statistics there, and so we can actually start analyzing some of these data. Many of the, I think 2.5 million of these people, these players, provided demographic data as well. So in terms of their age, their gender, their location, their background as well. So aspects about whether they're left or right-handed, where they grew up, how many hours they sleep at night, a load of different factors, some of which we thought would be interesting to explore, some of which were controls and we were expecting to not have an impact. So far, we've had about 20 papers published in this on this data, and it's still ongoing now. So, as I said, we have this data on gender and age, which we know already to be particularly important factors in navigation. And this is a level which just shows some differences. So you can see the space and you can see where the flags are. And what we have here are 1,000 random people playing the game. The red ones you'll see are younger people and the blue ones are older people. And we'll start to actually see some of the actual differences between some of the players in terms of their ability to play the game and navigate. So you see the younger players already getting an advantage. The blue ones, who are the older players, are sort of further behind, and also quite a lot of the people getting lost are these older players. And now we're seeing the completion rate of the younger players pretty rapid compared to these older players too. So you can start to see some of these differences in the demographic factors. We'll just leave it until most of the younger players complete. So at this point, we've had about 3/4 of younger players complete, and still only about 1/3 of the older players have completed this level. So we can start unpicking this even more in many different ways. So we can see how this particular graph over here, this shows the performance. So this is a measure of performance in terms of distance. It's slightly complicated. I haven't put it in the slides here. Composite measure of performance, but essentially it's how efficiently people complete the game. But we can see there's a difference between gender. Males are generally better than females, and that also performance declines rapidly or quickly as you progress in age. So people who are sort of up to 70 really performing quite poorly in some of these navigation tasks. And this is a sort of, that's a finding that's been shown in many other studies. We actually see this increase in improvement in performance as age increases beyond 70, 75. And this is we think it's a self-selection bias. So people who are good navigators, who are older people who are good at navigating, are more likely to play the game rather than something else. But that's an interesting finding. We also see this variation over geography. So we see some countries doing much better. So countries such as Finland, Denmark, New Zealand, Canada, and the US. The Nordic countries and North America doing particularly well in terms of navigation, and some of the sort of poor performing countries are Egypt, India, Romania. We'll come to this in a second. So I think we think about cities. We're very interested in cities. One thing we looked at as well, and one of the questions we asked was about where you grew up, whether it was in a city or not. And we actually noticed a very interesting difference in performance, where people who grew up outside of cities were better at navigating. So this got us thinking about what is the role of city structure in mediating navigation performance. So where you grew up, how does it influence how good you are at navigating? And so if we can see that people who grow up outside of cities do better, what is it about cities that makes, differentiates people? And after a bit of sort of thinking around the subject, we started looking at the structure of street networks. And I'll go over this fairly quickly, but the essential finding is that this measure of street network entropy, which is a measure of how varied the angular deviation is of the streets, shows a strong effect with navigation ability. So where you grew up in areas with in countries with a low variation in street angle, so the US in particular, Canada, Argentina, where you have these grid structured streets, you're generally a worse navigator. So within this game, so somewhere like Prague, you've got a street network like this, where lots of different sort of angled streets, very much the organic, as we call it, street structure, developed over hundreds or thousands of years, relative to this street structure, which is the sort of typical North American gridiron sort of street structure. If we use these measures of street network entropy and plug them into our model, what we see is that these particular countries with a low street network entropy show a big effect in terms of the impact on performance. We looked actually quite a lot of different measures here in terms of the routes people take, so how many turns someone has to take, or looked at betweenness, centrality, decreased centrality, a load of different factors about the street network or how someone might navigate through the street. But even after all of these, street network entropy was the one that showed the biggest effect. So there's clearly something about the structure of the environment influencing how good you are at navigating as well. I should say as well, it's not necessarily how good you are, because in some cases, the people from these low street network entropy countries, and the places which had these grid structures, they actually outperformed others. So it was really about how similar that street, in certain levels, the structure of the level was very similar to a grid-like structure, and in those places, the people with from those gridded areas perform better. So there's a lot going on here, but it's interesting to see that there actually is a very strong relationship here between the city structure and navigation performance. Okay, so what does all this mean really then for urban analytics? Okay, so at the heart of urban analytics and heart of spatial analysis and quantitative geography, we have this set of assumptions around how people relate to space, and we're all very probably familiar with things like Tobler's law. What we do though is neglect some of the heterogeneity within the populations that have a really fundamental impact on them. So while we might incorporate noise or error into our models, these estimates generally lack precision. We don't really understand where that error exists. We don't look at deviation in performance or variation in behavior in the same way that we've done with that C-Hero Quest project that I just talked about. We also really only look at space as a Euclidean, so we sometimes might apply a weight, we might look at distance by time, but rarely do we consider the role of landmarks or particular features in this choice process or this behavioral process. So I think there's an opportunity here, and I'll talk about a couple of bits of work on this area, in how we encode that relationship between people and urban spaces within our models, within our data, to improve how we predict cities. So one particular bit of work here is building on some a qualitative study, which took place back in 1960 by Kevin Lynch, who and this is a fairly famous piece of work called Image of the City. And what Lynch did was basically go around and ask people to sketch out what were their most, sketch out Boston. I think he did Boston and Los Angeles in this little book. It's a nice little book. Recommend getting it. It's all lots of nice little drawings in there. And what his theory, what he found was that there are particular types of feature in urban space that characterized how people think about these spaces. And this is a particular theory that's been, quite influential in planning and architecture for quite a while now. But you'll see things like landmarks, nodes, so major junctions, perhaps edges between different regions, particular paths and districts, all being quite fundamental in terms of how people conceive these spaces. And what we set out to do is actually translate these elements of the call into GIS, into a quantitative model that could be used within analysis. So this is what Lynch developed in terms of Boston. This was a composite of various people's maps, and what you can see are the different sorts of feature landmarks, particular major nodes, particular edges of regions, major paths, these big roads perhaps that sort of frame the region, and regions and districts as well. And so each of these elements we needed to sort of build into our model. So all we did was take a load of different kind of fairly generic urban analytics approaches and put them together. It was nothing too complicated. For identifying nodes, and this was taking open source data, OpenStreetMap data. We looked at use between the centrality to identify the most prominent nodes within the city. And between the centrality has been shown to be an important factor in estimating activity at particular junctions. For the paths, we did the same thing, but with a road network representation. So again, what we're looking at are the most prominent roads in that network, and this was identified in this way. The districts we looked at used a community detection method to look at how cohesive different regions are. So this is this is the product of that, and you can actually see how different regions, based on their similarity of their street structures, were segmented off, and actually it does align with some of the regions in as people could see for regions in Boston too. And then we also did some work on landmarks as well. So we were thinking about how do we classify a landmark? How do we determine how important it is? And so we actually it was a composite of how visually salient a landmark is, its contextual importance as well, and its position relative to other buildings as well. So this was the representation that we drew from that. Oh, and finally, edges. This was more of a kind of manual process, just to select what else might be a kind of very prominent sort of feature within the city, the edge of two kind of different types of neighborhood. So we actually had like major highways in this representation, the waterfront, railways. So there's things which might be considered barriers within a city. So we put it all together, and this is what we get. And we've we've done it. We've mapped it in a very similar way to how Lynch did. So we could actually kind of do a sort of back and forth between the two, and you can start to see some similarities. You can start to see some of the main roads are still there, which are quite relevant. You can see where there was, particular regions that might be segmented off as well. But there's also going to be differences too. There's going to be, we did our study in 2020, 2019. And Lynch did his in 60 years before that. So there's going to be differences in the city, but I think what we really wanted to do was show that you can take these theories about how people relate to spaces and create models from them, create actual usable models that can be used elsewhere. So this is effectively a GIS representation of how people might conceive cities or remember them, and how they might think about cities. Just conscious of time, but I'll press on until I'm told otherwise. So this next one is about inspired by that study, and really broadening it to thinking about cognitive costs. So yeah, as I said before, we often think about how people in space relate as a kind of Euclidean process. So people think about the distance as a Euclidean distance, a straight line distance. And actually, I think some of those prior studies show that this relationship is more complex than that. It relates to these urban spaces. And what we set out to do with this next study was try to capture some of the literature that's out there through decades of research into how people in space relate in terms of psychology research, and build it into a model. Again, like how do we operationalize some of this research? So what we did was do a sort of evidence synthesis process. This was looking at all of the literature that's out there about how different features in urban space impact on people's estimation of distance. And you can see some of the factors down on this left-hand side that were found to be relevant. There's some of the things we've already talked about at numerous points today: intersections, salient features or landmarks, travel speed as a factor, network order. Again, this is something which came up in the Sierra Quest study. Slope change, turns, route distance, barriers. All of these impact how you perceive how far something is away. These have all been shown. This is all, these have all been shown independently in small scale studies, but studies which have been published in the literature. So they all relate to different hypotheses about how space influences your perception. But some of these had useful findings. Some of them were less useful. So some of them were sort of fairly vague descriptions of the findings. Some of the findings were very precise. So what it was for us was to do was try to sort of combine these findings within a model. As I say, we won't go into too much detail here, but there's you can read about this in the paper if you're interested. But effectively, what we're doing is combining the effects of all of these factors in estimating distance. There's a process, it's an open source process. We published the data, published the notebooks as well. It's all based on OpenStreetMap data. And what we did was actually look at how cognitive distance might manifest over different cities, given all of these influences of different spatial features. And we can also compare that to network distances or straight line distances as well. And what we find is, and these are all the cities we've looked at. I slightly regret not including Hong Kong in this study now, but we didn't. And what we have is essentially is a headline figure, this kind of measure, which is the ratio of cognitive distance as we've characterized it, and Euclidean distance. And what we find is places like Jakarta, London, Paris, which have these quite heterogeneous street environments with, quite diverse features, have a stronger impact on how fast some people might perceive two places to be apart. So in London, you're likely to perceive the same distance to be longer than you would in, say, somewhere like New York, just by virtue of the environment. And you can see some of the differences between, some of the street structures like Delhi here, or at least the area of Delhi that we explored in this study. They are quite structured, quite sort of homogeneous structured streets. So, I think there's a lot more work that can be done in this particular area. I think there's a very much a first look at how this might be done, but it gives you a sense of how you might develop a new estimation of distance compared to, which could be sort of comparable to Euclidean or network distances, and might better account for some of these impacts of the environment. I just this one just shows also some heterogeneity across the city as well. So the blue points show the Euclidean distance, where the red points show the cognitive distance, and you can see that some areas, some cities such as Mexico City with this quite strong grid structure shows quite strong similarity with the Euclidean distance, whereas other areas like London show quite a lot more variation. Okay, the last bit I want to talk about was agent-based models. It's another area of my work, and it's a very useful technique for embedding some of the things I've talked about today, such as heterogeneity, complex decision making, and even spatial variation, spatial knowledge within the model itself. And this is just to give you a flavour of what's possible. This is sort of arising from some of this previous work on using the minicab data, but what we did was build an agent-based model where the limitations of someone's knowledge and the choice process were a kind of hierarchical, complex sort of navigation choice process were explicitly modeled. So this is the sort of choice model which we built, which essentially builds on some of the theory I spoke about earlier. There's a region-based choice process which is refined to a landmark or junction-based choice, which then eventually becomes the roads that someone drives down. So that choice process is, we would say, more realistic based on the theory and the data than a shortest path, which would only focus on the roads. We consider these junctions and these other hierarchical structures that really influence how someone perceives space. We then obviously have to, in the same way I talked about before, is build this in data. You have to build these models within the actual, linking it through to GIS data. So we selected what particular nodes we would use, classify as major junctions. We classified regions using a community detection method. And we built these spatial representations that allowed us to model behavior. We also built a model of how people might have different knowledge of space. Some people might have spent a lot of time in the city and have knowledge of loads of space. Some people might have just spent a couple of years there and not really explored very much. So we also wanted to include that. The outcome is something like this, where you see differences in the behaviors of agents based on their experiences. So an experience, given an origin and a destination, an experienced agent would take a kind of path like this, which would be winding through some back streets, whereas an inexperienced agent would take a path which mainly went on the main roads. And all of this, of course, is built on this fairly complex decision process, but it's important to show that we can include this heterogeneity, and that it actually leads to quite strong differences in behavior. And then, this is almost going full circle now. We're going now into building the agent-based model. We had 125,000 agents with these complex, choice process and knowledge models. Included some factors about different driver types. Some people had more reliance on sat navs. Some people had different levels of tolerance for congestion, which would result in rerouting. Some would have access to traffic information. There's quite a lot of variation in here as well as this, which is sort of obviously quite important to include. And what we generate at the end of it are flow models and congestion models. This is the aggregation of all of these complex behaviors and decisions and knowledge structures. And that really takes me to the point I made right at the start, which is cities are complex. Really it's all about how do we capture the people at the heart of these complexity in as much realistic detail as possible. So just to conclude then, I think we've said there's it's shown there's a strong evidence of heterogeneity in cognition, that shown you how this different data sets can show the relationship between people and space, and factors that, a variety of factors that might influence navigation performance. But my main campaign point, I suppose, is to say, how do we do this better in urban analytics? How do we build better models and better spatial data that represents this relationship between people and space better? And I think there's lots of opportunities here. If you're interested in this study or these studies, or collaborating, or even being a PhD student on this, then do get in touch. My contact details are there, thanks to a variety of my collaborators and funders, and there's a variety of papers to read as well. So thanks. That's all.
Thank you very much, Ed. It's a very stimulating, fantastic talk covering many topics comprehensively and systematically. Now the floor is open for questions. Okay, Jeff, please.
Hi, thanks a lot, Ed. I have a question because I know there's some sociologists in the audience. Traditionally, urban planning scholars and urban sociologists have looked at a lot of the spatial dimensions of inequality, but they've looked at that with a lot of like micro census data on tract level inequalities and those edges that you talk about, like you think of like Robert Moses's highways racially segregating different parts of New York City. And I'm wondering, what's the real contribution here is that I think conventionally then we've been looking at a lot of that spatial inequality in terms of stocks, but you're bringing a possibility we can look at the flows. And I'm interested since like a lot of white men and other privileged groups have planned a lot of cities in terms of how people move around, that you might trace some of those inequalities and how easily people move through space in terms of looking at how those people that have the power to plan and structure the built environment have made it more difficult for certain disadvantaged groups to move around easier for others, and how your data and methods could help us understand that.
Yeah, it's a great point. Thanks very much for that question. So I think there's a lot to be said. I mean, there's been some work, as you say, around the barrier effects of the spatial environment in terms of disrupting how people move between particular areas. And I think an analysis process which can capture some of those barriers better in a more systematic way would be beneficial. So I've not seen that yet, but I think that's something we could certainly look at. Of course, getting data on, getting data at the large scale that is representative is always challenging in that sort of areas. One thing we have looked at, though, which we didn't publish, but I think others have looked at it similarly, is how inequality manifests at the sort of destinations as well, and on the sort of transport networks. So if you think about, as you say, we might look at inequality sort of demographic, in terms of demographic and census tracts. You could think about particular train lines and how people mix on particular train lines. I mean, one thing when I lived in London, what I particularly enjoyed about living in London was when you were on the tube and the underground, it felt like there was a real mix of people. But actually, if we really grilled into that, you'd probably find there wasn't as much of a mix as you might consider across the whole city. In the morning, maybe in the 5 a.m. I always like to think about the sort of financial districts in London. In 5 a.m., at 5 a.m. there might be the cleaners coming into the city on the underground, whereas at 8 a.m. it might be the bankers, and they may spatially overlap, but spatially temporally they don't. And so that's quite an interesting sort of way to look at it. There has also been some work at MIT. They looked at how people from different neighborhoods visited different locations, different sort of activity locations, and how different activity locations had different mixes of people as well. So I think there's, as you say, I think there's a lot of, these new data allow you to look at the sort of mixing or inequalities within the population in different ways, but in better ways than are particularly in census data alone. And as I say, if we can build in some of the findings from the spatial cognition literature that might be a driver of these inequalities than all the better, I think.
Okay, another question from Vincent. I need to read it because then it can be recorded. Could you please tell us how the individual sensory perception of space could be integrated into your cognitive models? For example, visual perception of vegetation or audio perception of cars.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's a challenge here with, I assume we're talking about, so for me, the end point of my models are the agent-based models. So whenever I think about something where we're expanding the data, the inputs, I'm always thinking about scale. So how do we scale this to the sort of like 100,000 agents? So this sort of scares me, this kind of question. But having said that, you know, I think there's definitely opportunity. I believe an area I didn't talk about was sort of the role of AI in these models. And some work that came out of DeepMind a few years ago used street view imagery to train a reinforcement learning navigation agent. And so while that sort of lacks theory in the context of some of the things we talk about here, there was this. They were able to replicate how someone might navigate through a city based on their visual perception. So so if you think about street view imagery, you can decompose it to look at, you know, particular features, say, you know, identify landmarks or identify vegetation, or you know, maybe even you know, maybe even vehicles. But that is certainly something that is something that's going on. And I think it would be very interesting to do. Yeah, as I say, DeepMind managed to do it with a reinforcement learning agent. You know, they trained on very large computers. So it's not something I've looked at yet, but I think it would be quite interesting to do. So yeah, it's something certainly to think about.
Okay, then Jeroen, please.
Hi, yes, hello. Thank you so much. And thank you, Ed, for the great lecture. My question is about the kind of qualities and the impact on specific neighborhoods when you take the sort of collective effect of all these individual trips. You talk a lot about origin destination points, cognitive navigation. It's kind of assuming that people already know where they want to go. And myself and my colleagues are interested in the sort of more spontaneous behavior that maybe make people decide to slow down or stop or have interactions within certain areas like the shopping streets or pedestrian areas. So the kind of diversion or optional activities that would lead to this sort of chemistry within certain districts that generate, you know, social and economic value for that neighborhood. I wonder if you have done any work on this, or how your models relate to those kind of considerations.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's not something I've looked at precisely. You know, as I say, you know, as you point out, you know, a lot of what I've talked about so far is about someone navigating from a particular origin to a destination. But what are you talking about more, say, shopping behavior or dwelling behavior? Is that what you're sort of referring to? Yeah, I think I wouldn't want to comment too much, less I, you know, not quite my area, but my sense would be, and from sort of talking to people like researchers in space syntax who I used to engage with at UCL, that would be that there are certain qualities of the environments that promote different types of activities. So there may be that a street is very busy, and you know, there's it means people are less likely to stop, or there's other features about the environment, such as the availability of benches or like tree cover, or particularly how attractive a particular sort of like salient or attractive the buildings are. These all seem to have impact on whether someone's going to sort of slow down or stop or so forth. So how that plays into this process, I'm less clear on. What I'm thinking about mostly is about that goal-directed behavior, and this person's trying to get to this location. This is their task, and they're trying to find features in this built environment that let them get there. However, perhaps when someone is navigating around the city, they do have a target in mind. Where's their next target? That might well be something which is, so they may well be slowly completing this kind of process of having a goal in mind, with a sort of willingness to stop and find sub goals along route to that final destination. If I think about self-shopping, I'd probably think, oh, I'll go to that shop, and then on the way I might just spot a sub goal and stop there, or spot a cafe and go there. I think that's a process that might well be occurring. Sorry, I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I do.
No, it's great reflections on future opportunities for further studies, I suppose.
As you say, I think there's a lot of areas. All the questions are sort of revealing areas of additional research opportunity. So it's great to hear.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. So any more questions?
Maybe I'll raise a short question.
Yeah, please.
Yes. In talking about the shortest path analysis, the first set of studies you talk about, you showed us a list of definitions of shortest path, and none of them overlap with the observed path that much, 20, 30 some percent. Have you tried using so-called alternatives? That is, if any of these match, then it's still counted as an overlap, a compatible use of shortest path as a criteria to determine my actual path, because as you admitted, there are lots of heterogeneity across persons. Different people may use different so-called preference, prioritizing different types of shortness. And therefore, across a whole population of agents, or even the same person on different occasions, I may be prioritizing different things. So what I do in one moment may not be the same as what I would do in another circumstance. And therefore, statistically, is necessary at least to allow for so-called multiple switching of definitions, optimization criteria across situations, even though I only use one definition. That is already an extremely simplistic assumption. Even if I just use one definition at a time, as a statistical matter of measuring overlap, should I be using a different statistical metric to measure overlap? That is my simple question.
Yes, I think that's a good point. I mean, there was something I hadn't looked at was how frequently some paths were 100% correct. So that I think that's a good point. But the issue, I think, well, this was actually more of a computational issue, was generating. I think it was something like 18 different shortest path models. Computationally, for 700,000 routes was extremely computationally intensive. But I think it's something I kind of slightly regretted, because I've had similar questions before, whereas but it's a very valid point. I think there is, to some extent, I would be interested to know. I suppose it's sort of how much. I'm trying to think what's the right framing, but how much how frequently that those nearly short, there is close relationship between the observed and the shortest path. That would be quite interesting to see. But unfortunately, the only metric I have is the overlap.
That's okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Just a clarification.
Yeah.
So any more questions? Yeah, actually, I got a question. Okay, I'm very interested in your shortest path study. So basically, you use a binary classification method to assign some trips to the shortest path. Some are not. It's typical binary classification method, but in terms of the route cost, for example, distance or travel time, then most routes are quite close to the shortest path.
That's true.
Then there is a contradiction here.
Yeah.
So in terms of the cost, it's quite close, but certainly in terms of binary classification, the matching rate is low.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so I think this is just to say, the key point for me is that there is no single path that is. It's very hard to find that single path that's going to estimate where someone, travels. So they may all very much be within a certain distance of that shortest path, but given the street network as it is, and the massive variety of alternatives, that our models have to reflect that heterogeneity. We have to kind of ensure there is lots of many alternatives are modeled. So yeah, I'm not sure I got your question right, but I think that's the reason for going down towards the agent-based modeling side, is to make sure that we capture that variation, that there is this heterogeneity in the heart of it, and that we're not just going to assume that everyone takes that one single path. Another way would be to assume that people do take different shortest paths, right? Some people take the least time path, some people take the least turn path. But I think what the other studies sort of show are that the process is more iterative, that people gravitate towards a particular sub-goal, and maybe they are minimizing the distance between those sub-goals, but overall the combination of these sort of segments will not relate to a shortest path. So it's not only about the path itself, it's how the path is generated, it's how it's produced, and it's whether it's an optimization process or something else.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. So any more questions from the floor? If no questions.
Can I
Yeah,
raise
sure.
a future agenda for you? As I said before, your extremely rich and interesting talk. I was thinking from the perspective of a sociologist. We have a long-standing interest in social network. Just think about myself. Social heterogeneity can come from many sides, and one of the crucial sides in relation to social spatial connection to me would be my spatial pattern of recreational sites. Typical, that is one thing. And also that is by activity center, organizational based, informal organizational based way of organizing my cognitive map. Another would be really social network. Of course, the two are overlapping. Social network, who are my significant others that I keep on thinking about, I keep on contacting, whether it's recreational or not, that would really define in my mind, recall in my memory actually, all the important locations where I got to remember how to get there are my most important others. So that sort of thing would not be available in a typical urban analytic type of data unless you have overtime data on the same agent, where they travel most often, and then try to correlate that with their social network structure or their activity network structure. Is there any future chance for doing this kind of research to check?
I mean, that sounds, yeah, I mean, that's a great point. I mean, I sort of hinted at this, you know, how you develop that knowledge is a product of what you do, and that's a product of who you know and where you meet and all these sort of things. So all of your social interactions through work or through personal life, you know, will influence how you develop your knowledge of space and then how you navigate through it. Collecting data is the harder part, you know, as you all know. It's we have seen a couple of studies which have tried to work with undergraduate students, you know, when they first arrive and try to understand who knows who, and you know, but I've never seen anything large scale, and so perhaps that's the next big large scale study, is to try to capture social interactions alongside navigation. I'm particularly interested, as you say, in how people develop this over time. You know, I'm very interested in that process of someone arriving in a city, not knowing it, what they do, you know, as they live in that city, and how their behaviour changes, and how some of those even early interactions with the city then influence their later behaviours, or you know, essentially a path dependence arises because you choose to go to the shop that first day, and therefore it influences where you go in future. So I think it's fascinating to think about those things. Just very difficult to get the data. So in some ways I see the appeal of sort of very speculative models, but at the same time, I'm not sure reviewers do. They like to see the data backing these up. So
yeah, the kind of data that I would guess may be relevant would be social media data with GPS tagging. When you have geotagging with together social media data, you have both the communication networks, or you can by definition call it social network, certain type of social network, as well as geographical mobility pattern of an individual over time.
Yeah, I think that would be great. Yeah, I've looked at Twitter data in the past, but obviously that's incomplete, you know, in terms of social interactions. You know, if you were able to get something like, you know, a Facebook sort of level data where you can identify locations of people, and then yeah, I think that would be great. You know, yeah, it's quite difficult to get. Maybe I'll go and ask them. I think it's a great idea.
Okay. Perfect.
You can always try. Yeah, activity based. Yeah. Well, yeah, that's true. WhatsApp data would be great data to get hold of if you could do it. And what we've done before is asked people, you know, and we're by no means experts on this stuff, but asking people who they interact with, and then also collected travel card data. So we looked at how people traveled together, not in the context of spatial cognition, just more in the context of group travel behaviour. So yeah, but you know, that social network data is not is hard to collect accurately. Although, you know, matching it with travel card data can be quite informative, obviously, because that's a bit more accurate in terms of, you know, seeing how people travel together, at least.
Thank you.
So any more questions? If no questions, then we will come to a close to this talk. So thank you very much, Ed, for the fascinating talk. Also, I mean, the discussions are quite fruitful. Yeah, I really enjoyed it, and also thank all the audience for your participation. Yeah, thank you very much. I hope to see you in person somewhere in the future.
Yeah.
Maybe on campus.
That'd be great. It looks great. Yeah, very, very well. I'm very pleased to join and meet you. Thanks very much.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you again.
Bye.